What we want is economic equity. We want fairness. We don't want government-backed criminals. And that's what we've got. These people are criminals. In my book, The Curse of Canaan, I trace it back 5,000 years. These people didn't start yesterday. They have perfected these techniques over thousands of years. They have family dynasties all over the world. And they're simply used to having their own way. But in the modern world, they're totally obsolete. They're totally archaic. And they've got to go, and they're going to go. Thank you. Oh, sure. Now, we do have time for a couple of questions, and I'll welcome any questions, and I'll try to answer them. You know, the old technique was that you'd be asked a question in a public meeting, and you would say, "I'm so glad you answered that. I'm so glad you asked that question," and then they would proceed not to answer it. But I've never done that. I'll answer any question, and I'll be glad to entertain questions. Yes.
I missed your name.
Mullins, Eustace Mullins, Mullins. People think it's an Irish name, but it's actually French. It's Moulin, which means miller in French. And
just squeeze the handle, adjust the height. Just squeeze it and.
You made a compelling case for what happened to Lincoln and to Kennedy. Of course, Kennedy with Executive Order 11110, June 4, 63. Do you have anything to say or any confirming information on Garfield and McKinley? Was the same motive behind the assassination of those two presidents?
Well, the assassinations of Garfield and McKinley were done by the bankers because they were working to get this central bank set up, you see. They were planning for it. And both Garfield and McKinley totally objected to it. So they had to be gotten rid of. They were murdered simply because they were in the way of the central bank plan. And almost all of these things that happen because the bankers want them to. See, the average American citizen or Canadian citizen is not really out to assassinate anybody. They might not like a particular politician, but they're not going to assassinate him. The assassinations have to be carefully planned. There has to be a lot of money behind it. Now, what they did with Kennedy, they flew in a group of Sicilian killers from Marseille. They were the ones that actually carried out the assassination. But like I say, they had 5 teams there because this had to go forward, and they couldn't have any recrimination, and they wanted it to happen. So if one team didn't do it, the other team, and so the Sicilians did it. And they flew them to Canada, by the way, to a safe house immediately after the assassination. They stayed here in Canada for 5 days. It's all been documented. And then they flew him back to Marseille. So that's how it was done.
Any comment on Robert Kennedy?
Robert Kennedy was a revenge killing by the mafia. And
I'm sorry, Eustace?
Oh, Robert Kennedy was a revenge killing by the mafia. He was no threat to them anymore because they'd killed his brother. In fact, the happiest moment of J. Edgar Hoover's life was when he picked up the phone and called Robert Kennedy and said, "Your brother has been killed," and he hung up. And Robert Kennedy was devastated by that. He never recovered because they really hated each other. Actually, Robert Kennedy hated homosexuals in the first place, and he simply considered that J. Edgar Hoover, as head of the FBI, was totally subordinate to the Attorney General. Well, all the previous Attorney Generals had allowed J. Edgar Hoover to do whatever he wanted to because they were pretty much afraid of him. Kennedy was the first person that ever opposed him. And Kennedy, by the way, was murdered in the Ambassador Hotel. Now, the Roni Plaza Hotel in Miami Beach was the winter headquarters of the Mafia, and that's where J. Edgar Hoover and Clyde Tolson spent their winter vacations. So, but Robert Kennedy was murdered in the Ambassador Hotel, which was also a Shine Hotel, a Mafia hotel. See, the Mafia recruited a guy named J. Meyer Shine to handle their real estate interests, mostly movies and hotels. And so with the Mafia money, J. Meyer Shine built these lavish hotels and movie theaters around the United States, which were all Mafia stuff. And so when Robert Kennedy went to the Ambassador Hotel, he had no idea he was walking into the hands of the enemy. I'm sure he had no idea that there was a mafia hotel. And because Robert Kennedy was a different person from myself. We worked together on the McCarthy Committee, by the way. But Robert Kennedy, with all of his money and influence, he had other people do things. Well, I never had anybody do anything. If I wanted to do anything, I had to go and research it myself. The result was all of my information was firsthand. Everything Robert Kennedy got was filtered to him. And as I say, when he went to the Ambassador Hotel, he had no idea he was walking into his own assassination. I would have known that. I would have known it was a Shine Hotel. And Shine, by the way, his son David, was the Shine-Cohn partnership which sabotaged McCarthy's fight against the communists. McCarthy let me go in order to hire Cohn and Shine. So I have a personal memoir of that.
Well, first, Eustace, thanks so much for accepting Wes's invitation to bring your experience to Canada. What's your take on JFK's Jr.? Was that just a Washington airplane he was using, like a Washington heart attack?
JFK made a fatal mistake. First of all, he was a very dangerous person because he was the most famous celebrity in the United States. Second, he had $150 million of his own. Third, he had his own national magazine. This makes you an extremely dangerous person. And fourth, he had decided to do an all-out expose of Mossad and the Anti-Defamation League as the most dangerous influence in American politics. Well, when you embark on a program like that, you're going to develop some engine trouble. That's all. One of the first things that Ezra Pound told me, he says, you have to learn the difference between interest-bearing currency and non-interest-bearing currency. Well, he might as well have been talking Greek to me. I never heard such confusing terms in my knowledge, because I thought, how can currency be interest-bearing? But it is. All the currency is interest-bearing. And we have two dead presidents who could testify to that, because in 1863, President Lincoln, in order to finance the war, which the bankers did not want him to finance the war. They wanted the United States to split into two small countries, the North and the South. So they wouldn't lend him any money to fight the war. And he called in the bankers and he said, look, I've got to finance the war. I want to borrow some money. They said, well, yes, you can have money at the 19% interest. Well, the average interest rate at that time was 1%. So Lincoln knew that the bankers were having him on. So he looked around and someone told him, well, the Treasury lawfully can issue money which is non-interest bearing called greenbacks. And so Lincoln said, well, I'll do that. So he issued the greenback currency, non-interest bearing currency, and financed the Civil War with that. Well, of course, the bankers were very annoyed by this because they lost a lot of money on the interest that they would have gotten on interest-bearing currency. So when you cross the bankers, they have only one answer, and that's assassination. So they assassinated Lincoln. Well, 100 years later, we got another young, bright president, John F. Kennedy, who had gone to Harvard, but apparently did not take any history courses, because someone told him Kennedy, like most presidents, wanted to be remembered. And he asked some of his advisors, what could I do to really get the people behind me and have them appreciate me for what I've done? And so one of them said, why don't you go after the Federal Reserve System? They said, if you will get the Federal Reserve System off the backs of the American people, they'll put statues of you in every town in the United States. So Kennedy thought, well, that's a very attractive proposition. I think I'll do that. So he goes over to the Treasury and says, print me up some non-interest-bearing currency, the greenback currency. Well, they did this. And of course, then the bankers again were horrified. They said, well, what is this guy doing? He's going to ruin us. So they hurriedly, he had this vice president named Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Kennedy had already decided to dump Johnson, which meant that his political future was nil. And so Johnson said to Kennedy, well, look, we're having a little trouble with the party down in Texas. Why don't you go down to Dallas and see what you can do? So when Kennedy went to Dallas, they had not one, they had 5 different assassination teams waiting for him. In case one didn't make it, the other would back up, you know. So Kennedy didn't make it, and that was the end of the greenback currency on Kennedy. So he went the same way as Lincoln, simply because he issued non-interest bearing currency, which I admit is confusing and sounds dull and routine, but unfortunately this is the way that the world operates. These bankers are always conspirators, they're criminals, and they'll do anything to keep their system going. These people are criminals. In my book, The Curse of Canaan, I trace it back 5,000 years. These people didn't start yesterday. They have perfected these techniques over thousands of years. They have family dynasties all over the world, and they're simply used to having their own way, but in the modern world, they're totally obsolete, they're totally archaic, and they've got to go, and they're going to go. Thank you.